Hi there. My name is Will Trackman. I'm the General Counsel here at Mountain States Legal Foundation. We're going to get started with our November webinar in our So a Neighbor Asked series. We have a fantastic topic today and two incredibly well-credentialed guests to talk about our issue. The question is, So a Neighbor Asked, what does the Trump administration mean for liberty over the course of the next 4 years? I'm going to introduce our two guest speakers today, and we'll have a fantastic conversation. We're going to go about 45 minutes. There is a Q&A box on your screen. So if you have a question, go ahead and drop it in that box whenever you think of it. We'll probably get to those questions around the 30 or 35-minute mark, but no need to wait. If you have it before then, feel free to drop it there. With that, let me introduce Trent McCotter and Jeanette Brown. Trent is a partner at the Boyden Gray firm and also the director of the Catholic University Separation of Powers Clinic. He's a graduate of the University of North Carolina for both undergrad and law school. He clerked for Second Circuit Judge Stephen Menashe and is our co-counsel on at least a couple of cases involving natural resources and property rights issues. And Jeanette Brown, I have the honor of introducing. She is the general counsel and a senior litigator at the New Civil Liberties Alliance. She is a mentor of mine, the former general counsel in this seat at Mountain States Legal Foundation, a former partner at Kirkland & Ellis, and a graduate of Georgetown Law School. We're very honored to have her for old time's sake, as well as everything else. You might notice that my name is Karina Constancio on your screen. That's not accurate. It's Will Trackman. And you'll also see that I'm in the early stages of my Christmas beard. That's not just because I forgot to shave this morning. With all that said, let's jump right into our program. Trent, the first question is for you. In the broadest terms, I mean, you've seen transitions before from one administration whiplashing to the other administration. What were the first things that came across your mind after November 5th? You're watching the election returns go through, and obviously the results of the election are there. But in terms of the impacts and the consequences of those results, what were your initial, most basic thoughts about transitioning from one to the other administration?
Thanks, Will, and thanks for having me. So I do a lot of administrative law, as you both know, essentially suing the federal government. And so the first thing that really came to my mind were all of the pending lawsuits over regulations from the Biden administration. And you think of all the like alphabet soup of federal agencies that are out there. People have probably heard of some of the big ones like EPA, but there's what 50 others that 100 others that regulate parts of their lives that they don't know about, and they've always been like kind of a problem, like a bit of a thorn in people's side, a headache, a regulator, that sort of thing. But the last 4 years, they've been supercharged. You think about the Biden administration priorities, like addressing climate issues, where they say we're adopting a whole of government approach. So what that means is every agency, even if they're not really supposed to be dealing with environmental or climate issues, takes it upon themselves to issue regulations that they think will address it. So a good example came up just the other day in my own life. Our water heater is about to die, and the guy comes out to repair it or to replace it, and he says, well, if you want an electric water heater, kind of the standard one that's been around, you better buy it now, because starting in 2026, it'll be prohibited for you to buy one. You'll have to get one of these hybrid kind, and they don't work as well. Nobody likes them, and the government has to give you thousands of dollars in tax credits to get you to buy one now. But soon enough, that'll be the only thing you're allowed to buy. And of course, I knew, and he didn't. This surely traces back to some reg from some federal agency that has nothing to do with environment or climate or anything like that, but feels like, okay, well, what can we touch? Well, we can monitor and we can regulate appliances. And so that's what they do. It's the same thing with dishwashers and washing machines. So, like, both in my mind, there's lawsuits challenging a lot of these things. Like, that's what I was thinking of right after the election. Like, what's going to happen with those? A lot of those regs, one way or another, are going to go away. But also, like, to come back to the question of this entire discussion, like, how would you explain this to someone who's not a lawyer, who doesn't spend their time suing the government like we do? Like, all those things in your life where someone tells you, like, you can't do that, or you have to do this, or you're not going to be able to do that anymore. Like, a lot of that goes back to federal agencies and regulatory stuff. And I think the real hope is that the Trump administration is going to cut back on a lot of those sorts of things and kind of let people decide like what they want to buy. There's all kinds of other examples I can get into, but like that was my initial thinking of what's it really gonna look like over the next 4 years, the things that dominate our lives without us even realizing the source of them.
Yeah, what's interesting, and I know this is true for NCLA and the Separation of Powers Clinic, is we don't endorse candidates. We don't say, oh, Trump ought to win, or we support Trump or endorse Trump. And yet we have to recognize what a mess the federal agencies are under the Biden-Harris administration. We aren't shy about criticizing the current administration for all of its missteps. Jeanette, same question to you. What was going through your mind as you see these election results come through in terms of your work, your everyday life, and what other impacts there might be?
Yeah, to Trent's point, I was thinking about sort of existing litigation and sort of how to reorient. My first thought really was, okay, let's get to work. We have a potentially narrow window of opportunity. We're pretty confident that we've got, the next 2 years where we've got majority all the way around. And so if we're going to make some legislative changes to back up some of this rolling back of administrative state and agencies, we need to get to work. So part of it was sort of strategic regarding, okay, some of our cases, I think, I hope, get resolved because I think that the new administration will be more logical and more in line with recognizing the limits on the government. My biggest hope on a personal level is sort of that opportunity opens up again. I think to Trent's point, those regulations, they not only impact, your liberty, but they impact opportunities. You see it a lot in the Western states with the federal control of land, but everything from that to obviously oil and gas drilling to, the controlling of appliances. I've got a suit against the EPA related to refrigerants. All of those things sort of need to be reevaluated in terms of return on investment, or whether or not the objectives of those regulations and or statutes match up with the cost that's being inflicted on individual liberty and opportunity. And so I'm very hopeful. There's, like I said, there's so much to try and get done in the next couple of years, but I'm hopeful that there's a strong look at that. And I hope too that it causes people to have a better understanding of individual liberties, and that liberties and rights are natural and do not come from the state, that this trend towards sort of reversing individual rights and this discussion of public rights, I hope that reverses, and that the government isn't in a position to make the type of argument that they made, for example, in Jarkissi, where they said essentially, hey, if we pass a statute that says we can regulate something nobody's thought of before, you don't have any jury trial or Article 3 rights. That sort of thing needs to just come out of the government way of thinking.
Yeah, sticking with you, Jeanette, NCLA litigated the famous case from last summer. Some people call it Loper Bright, but really it's relentless. And you call it that because actually Justice Jackson was recused from Loper Bright. So if you want to call it a 6-3 decision, you have to refer to relentless. But do you see the consequences of that case potentially playing out with some of the deregulatory ideas that we're talking about, that maybe people who want to challenge the Trump administration will say, well, now that Chevron deference to executive branch agencies is gone, it's actually going to be easier to challenge everything the Trump administration tries to undo from the Biden administration? Or is that a concern of yours?
Based on sort of my understanding, our expectations of where the administration is going to go, it's not a real concern, because I think that the biggest problem that led to Loper Bright was administrative agencies trying to expand and exceed their bounds. And if this administration sort of follows the mandate that I think the public gave it and rolls back the administrative state to what it needs to do or was meant to do, I don't think the Loper Bright relentless gets in the way of that. I'm hopeful, to the point of the whiplash discussion earlier, I'm very hopeful that Loper Bright sort of allows us to create stability in, for example, the Title IX area, the environmental area, and a lot of the other areas where there has been substantial whiplash.
we've seen some announcements of the nominees who are going to be at these executive branch agencies. If you don't mind offering maybe a broad take, and then how important it is that that these appointees are themselves mindful of the things that we've been talking about, liberties, the expansion of the administrative state, and how important it is that they have as a priority scaling back some of the regulations or the things that these agencies do.
Yeah, I've seen maybe like the most like broad description of all the nominees is by and large they're kind of outsiders. Like they know about these areas, they have interest in them, but they're not people who've always, worked at the agency and kind of been there for 20 years and worked their way up and this is their next step. And I think that aligns a lot with what President Trump ran on. And I think it also will help in terms of like curtailing the abuses of the agency because they're not thinking necessarily like what about this particular regulation or what about this particular rule or statutory authority? They're thinking like, okay, I'm someone out there in kind of the real world who knows generally about this and I interact with a lot of people. Like, what are they worried about? What are they concerned about? And so like the example I gave earlier, like the water heater thing or like electric vehicle mandates, like the electric vehicle mandates are it's this complicated web of rules and regulations. Even like the smartest guys I know have a hard time figuring it all out. Like it's good to have someone at the head of an agency who says like I know these are a problem, like we need to do whatever we can to get rid of them. I don't need to know exactly like what regs are involved or what statutes are involved, but I need someone you want someone at the head of the agency where like that's their number one priority is just kind of like eliminating all of these problems. And if you have someone who's been there as kind of just like a creature of the agency, then they start to think like, oh, well, I said that going in, but now that I'm here, I'll go, I guess you're right. Maybe we shouldn't roll back all these things. Or I don't know. That's going to be really hard. And someone who's got kind of an outsider mindset or a businessman's mindset is just going to think like, this is not acceptable. Do what it takes. Like we're getting rid of this and we're moving on. So I think it makes a lot of sense, actually, a lot of the picks that the president's put up, given the messaging that he did.
Yeah.
But Will, I would have a question for you on that. I mean, based on your experience when the Department of Education last time, I think a lot of the problems or the difficulties that Trump ran into was with the career people at the agencies. And so, you can make all of the right political appointments, but if you're running into friction within the agencies, you're going to get bogged down. And I guess the flip side of the question to what Trent raised is, are these outsiders going to be able to manage that? I'd be interested in what you think.
It's a tough question. So, for those who don't know, I worked at the Department of Education under Secretary Betsy DeVos, and a huge amount of our work was spent battling through career civil servants for wet blankets about reform. And so they would say, oh, there's a reg that you don't know about, or there's an executive order that you don't know about, or there's a tradition that you don't know about, or there's 5 guidance documents from the 80s or 90s that contradicts. And so before we can do the thing that you want to do, we have to address all those other things. And the net of it is that you can get your priorities done. It's just you have to spend an enormous amount of time getting there. And it's not the thing that's at the top of the list that falls off. It's the next thing or the thing after that where you're like, oh, time ran out. So we can't get to Title VI reform because we're so invested in Title IX reform. So there is that general disadvantage if you aren't in the swamp already. You don't know where the bodies are buried. And so you end up asking a lot of questions. And the people that you ask those questions to, in many ways, are reliant on the civil servants who you're asking them to undo the work that they just did. So there definitely is a happy medium between the outsider perspective, which I definitely agree with Trent. You need to have that because you don't want someone dependent on the regs for their next job. Trump's going to come and go, but the idea is what sort of civil system are we going to have? But at the same time, you do need someone who's prepared to respond to the wet blanket concerns of the careers in the agency. Um,
Yeah, I
so,
think
yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think, and that's why, I mean, who knows for sure, but I think we'll probably see a lot of the kind of like deputy spots, like the number 2, number 3 people are ones who have worked at these agencies before in some capacity because they are the ones who kind of know the insides and know how to get it done. And I think like we learned some lessons from the 2017 transition. If you think back, the last time there had been a transition from Democrat to GOP would have been in 2001. And so there weren't people around really who are like explaining, okay, remember, we need to line these things up. We need to make sure we've got people set for these positions. We need to make sure that we've got a list of priorities and we kind of figure out how to do them and just keep pushing down on them. But we went through a lot of that with some growing pains, as you said, Will, in 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. And we've also now seen 4 years of kind of how the Biden team did it. And like they had some failures, but in other ways, like they were very successful in what they wanted to do in terms of getting things pushed through agencies. And so like we've now got all that experience. Plus now the deputies and the number three people at a lot of these agencies will have worked under the first Trump administration. So they know like what do we need to do? How do we do it? That sort of thing. So like maybe I'm being optimistic, but I have much kind of like higher expectations and like a stronger belief
Yeah.
over the next 4 years.
Let me put this to you both, either one of you. When you both have so much litigation, as does Mountain States, against Biden administration regulations and executive branch actions, I think the assumption might be, oh, well, we automatically win all those things, right? Because now there's a change in administration. Do either of you want to start and talk about what the consequences are in terms of the technical maneuvers now for pending litigation against Biden administration regs that have come out in the last 4 years?
I can start because I've had some clients say that sort of thing, Will, where they're like, all right, so like, okay, maybe not January 21st, maybe not January 30th, but like by mid-February, essentially we win, right? Like we'll file a lawsuit and the government will say we're right, and then they'll give us a bunch of money to cover our time and that sort of thing. And you have to explain, like, even with someone really aligned as, say, like the attorney general or the head of an agency or whatever, like even with those people there, like it's just like logistically, it's almost never going to work that way. And so for a lot of these regulations, it will depend on like where the case is. And we saw this with Biden. So cases where summary judgment's already been entered against the federal government, for example, and maybe it's up on appeal, I think the government will probably dismiss a lot of those appeals, in which case the rule has been vacated almost certainly during summary judgment. The rule's gone. You don't have to go through notice and comment. You don't have to do all that work. You don't have to spend half of your term just getting rid of the last guy's stuff. You can start fresh from the beginning. For cases where that's not going on, like maybe there's an injunction but not judgment, or maybe you haven't even filed a complaint yet. For those, it's going to be a lot harder. I think parties are going to try to negotiate something and get the court to sign off on getting rid of old rules. I think if I remember correctly, the Biden administration did that in a few cases. Agencies would say, hey, look, now that we've reevaluated things after January 20th, we actually think the plaintiffs have a pretty good argument here. Can you please give us some time to, reconsider, think about it, remand, maybe vacate, at the very least issue a bunch of stays of the rule so it doesn't go into effect. And by and large, like, are judges going to insist that the parties keep litigating when both sides say that they kind of want a second crack at it or they agree the rule is unlawful? It's like how much that actually ends up being used in cases, I think, is kind of TBD, but it will depend a lot on the posture of each case.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
definitely saw instances where the Biden administration would dismiss a complaint, like a complaint brought by the DOJ against a party where the U.S. was the plaintiff. We saw other instances where they didn't appeal losses because there was no intervener party that just went away. Right? Jeanette, you've written a little bit about sue and settle. What are your thoughts on that in this context, or the cases that NCLA is litigating right now and how they might be affected?
Well, on the sue and settle, I mean, I think that it's important for us to sort of stick to our principles in that, it is not right to try to force regulatory change essentially through litigation and to evade all of the sort of notice and comment and all of the protections that are built into the APA. And so, I think of some of the cases we have, some of the cases that we've just started, and I don't think that those types of cases should go into a sue and settle mandate. Um, where I do think that there should be settlements, is sort of more what I would consider non-regulatory conduct by some of the agencies. Um, for example, in our First Amendment cases against various of the agencies and the way that they've abridged and interfered with speech. But my experience during the last Trump administration was that I was hopeful that certain cases would get resolved because it seemed as though we had the key people in who would recognize that what the government was doing was wrong, and they just didn't. You know, the agency has clients, the agency, you know, intends to continue, and nobody likes to give up power. To Trent's point, it's one thing to be an outsider and not be part of the revolving door. Not everyone's going to have that mentality. And so I would like to think that more is going to get resolved than probably will. I'm not optimistic on that front. You know, we have a case against the SEC and we do a fair amount of litigation against the SEC. I don't really know that those types of cases will be impacted by the change in administration.
Yeah, that's a good question because that's something we've talked about as well. Like these independent, so-called independent agencies, where even on day one, you might have the chair resign, and so the president gets to redesignate the chair. So like the SEC, the president, presumably, you know, Gensler, I think, has said that he planned to leave, and so he would leave, and the president could then designate one of the other commissioners to be the chair, but that still just leaves a 2-2 vote. And so the chair can kind of like block anything from happening. The chair can't necessarily like affirmatively make something happen. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens with those kinds of cases in particular, where the agency probably has independent litigating authority, like they don't have to depend on DOJ. And so the SEC could have some of these cases and say, okay, fine, like we've got a new president, fine, like the chair is on board with trying to resolve some of these cases one way or another, but we just don't have a majority to do it until we get a fifth commissioner confirmed. So I think those will be especially interesting. Those are probably going to be much more drawn out.
Yeah, Jeanette, you're always talking about being principled. It's very, very annoying. I wish that we could just flip sides on these topics. Well, there's been a lot of discussion about abolishing agencies, maybe not filling some of the roles. Although one of the agencies that often gets discussed is the Department of Education, and there has been someone mentioned for a nominee there, Linda McMahon. What are the prospects in your mind of these very broad deregulatory efforts to get rid of an entire agency or maybe parts of agencies? Are those maybe a negotiation point where the Trump administration starts there and then moves to the middle, or is that a realistic goal for some of the alphabet soup that we're seeing in DC? Trent, why don't we start with your thoughts?
I suppose technically only Congress can eliminate an agency. I guess there are a few kind of like commissions and things that the president himself could eliminate, but in terms of like practically speaking, like eliminating an agency probably means you appoint your own secretary to run that agency with the goal of kind of just like minimizing everything that it does. I think I suspect even for like education, you would know better, and I'm actually kind of interested in your thoughts on this, Will. Like there are things that the education department like lawfully can do and should do under current statutory authority that I think would align a lot with the president's interests. Like a lot of universities that should probably be certifying compliance with Title VI on like, no discrimination and things like that. Like that seems like something that the Department of Education would be well suited for. I think there are other parts of it that a secretary could go in and just say, like, I'm the secretary now, and I'm essentially just saying we're not doing this anymore. Now, like, what happens to all the employees there and like the rulemakings and things is probably a little more nuanced. But I think, like, if you really wanted to, you could go into an agency and like partially shut it down by just saying we're not going to do any of these things. But so much of it has like this momentum, and so it's going to keep going unless you have someone really strong, like affirmatively come in and say we're not doing any of this stuff. Or I think more realistically, like we're going to shift a lot of focus from one thing to the other. It's just like that happens every time there's a transition, but like more so now. Like we're really going to shift. Like all these people in this division are now all shifted over to some other division, that kind of thing. I'd like to think that some of that is going to happen. Again, I think it depends a lot on who's actually in charge of the agency, because if you don't have someone in charge, the careers will just keep running it themselves.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Mountain States doesn't have a position on whether or not we should abolish the Department of Education. Obviously, we have a deregulatory mindset. You're right to point out that the department does a lot of things. It is, in fact, a behemoth. It's not just the department. It has 8 to 12 different subdivisions, depending on how you count, including a civil rights division, which does take assurances from schools and universities across the country, including enforcing Title IX due process requirements for sexual harassment investigations, opening investigations. So there's a lot, and a lot will depend on whether you were going to move that to DOJ or just shut it down entirely. I do think you're right that it'd be hard to just abolish an agency, although I have heard people say, well, through reconciliation, you could just bring its budget down to 1 cent so that
You
you
can do
can't
that.
pay anybody and there's no one there that can work there. Jonette, same question to you in terms of really broad, sweeping deregulatory efforts like this. Maybe not abolishing an agency, but firing lots of civil servants or doing something that is designed to not just cut around the edges of regulations themselves, but really change the way that the administrative state looks.
Yeah, I'm a pragmatist, so in the interest of efficiency, I don't know that any agency functions. Well, let me strike that. I think that some agencies may go, quote unquote, go away, but only because in the interest of efficiency, their core functions will be consolidated with some other agency. And so I think that we could have a shrinkage in volume without a shrinkage in, sort of major core functions. I think that what we need to see, and it was shocking to me after the recent Federal Society meeting and some of the feedback from that, from people seeing some of the Twitter feeds, and that how just incredibly frightened liberals are about what's going to happen to the administrative state. And they're saying things, like, oh, well, there goes clean drinking water, and all of these sort of things that it's not our purpose. It's no one's purpose to get rid of clean drinking water and sort of monitoring, some of the more important or natural functions. A lot of our problem is agencies going too far, number one, and then how they go about executing their mission. So for instance, the in-house tribunals. So I do think that if you took an examination of each agency, you would find areas where, in fact, the agency was stretching when it reached into that area, and that area needs to be peeled back and rolled away. And that's not shrinking for the sake of shrinking; it's shrinking for the sake of returning to your core mission and what it was Congress actually intended you to do and what you're supposed to do. So I do think that there will be, I pray that there's going to be a much smaller or somewhat smaller, noticeably smaller administrative state at the end of all of this. And I think that the way to get there is, through strategic evaluation. I don't think anyone has the intent, and I think that we should provide some reassurance. No one has the intent of just completely eliminating something for that purpose alone.
Yeah. I mean, I've also heard conservatives and libertarians, although mostly conservatives, say that we ought to use this power to reshape the administrative state to make it work for certain ends. So obviously we've seen Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency. Are there any things that you would want the federal government or the administrative state to do affirmatively? It reminds me of the one true ring of power, right? It's always very tempting to use the power when you have it. I mean, I'll just mention Title IX again. I mean, that was a big priority in the last Trump administration. There's gonna be sexual harassment allegations around the country. A lot of those went to kangaroo courts under Obama. So one of the pro-regulatory efforts was imposing due process standards on campuses around the country through the administrative state. Is there anything like that in your mind that would actually be positive, where the federal government is embarking on using the power of the executive branch to achieve maybe pro-liberty ends at the end of the day? Jonette, I'll put that to you first, and then Trent, if you've got the answer to the same question.
Yeah, my initial reflexive reaction is no, I don't want them doing anything for positive. And then coming back again to sort of the in-house tribunals, I think, and what the government did, the due process protections you were talking about last time, I think that if there is, if some of these in-house tribunals are not eliminated, or they aren't created as options 2 in our Article 3 court, I do think there needs to be an evaluation of the procedures in those agencies and greater protections and some sort of assurances of speedy resolution, so you don't see the bureaucracy sort of, waiting in government limbo for 6 years type of thing. And, some of the other clients that we've represented, particularly, again, the SEC is terrible about just leaving people's livelihoods in limbo for a decade. And so if the government's to do something, that's where I would want to see sort of some changes, but I would rather see them just do less of the in-house tribunals.
Fred, same question to you. Is there anything that you think of as being on the Trump administration agenda that would use the power of the federal government for good?
So I think a good example from when I was at the Department of Justice at the end of the first Trump term would be DOJ's Civil Rights Division used to focus a lot on things like religious liberty and conscience provisions, essentially like enforcing and kind of explaining and adopting rules on the existing statutory protections. So everyone knows about RFRA, but there's all kinds of other provisions that only kind of the real experts know about. But they're provisions that cover a lot of issues that are very kind of hot social issues about abortion. Some of them even would apply to like transgender surgeries, those sorts of things, that provide certain provisions and protections for employees. Like you don't have to participate in this sort of thing if you have a strong objection to it. And it used to be that DOJ would bring civil lawsuits against, say, a hospital or against other entities. It could even be against certain state entities, saying that we've got evidence of these provisions being violated, and so we kind of like on behalf of that person are going to bring a lawsuit because we're so concerned about it. There were some of those filed at the end of the Trump administration that were immediately dismissed after Biden came into office, which is obviously the president's prerogative. But I think that's an area where like using kind of the apparatus at DOJ to do something that it long had been doing and that enforces statutory rights and that sort of thing. I think that would be something that would be like a good thing to do and would enhance liberty and that sort of thing. I know we haven't really talked about it, but also like the use of criminal prosecution or not, I think will also be a very interesting issue. Like, will the U.S. attorney's offices around the country kind of step up and charge federal crimes in areas where local DAs have kind of taken like an ultra hands-off approach to the point that like it's a lot of liberty for the people who commit crimes, but it's to the point where it kind of impinges on like the social contract and people don't feel safe, like they can kind of go out and live their lives. And so in those cases, like, will the federal government use its prosecutorial powers or not? And then on the other side, there's cases that the current administration has brought using its criminal powers that I think the Trump administration will dismiss or get rid of, however, cases that they would not have brought in the first place, for the same kind of reasons, like concerns that these are being used against political opponents as opposed to using this against kind of like real serious criminal activity.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and related to that, I think I think there is a mandate actually from sort of the public to deal with the immigration issues. And so that's in terms of affirmative action. I feel like if that's going to be something the public has and as an expectation, and we will want to see from this administration in terms of taking affirmative action or taking assertive action.
Yeah. Well, questions are rolling in. If you have a question, go ahead and drop it in that Q&A box. We have a little bit less than 15 minutes for questions, but I'll go ahead and ask the first one to both of you. Feel free, either one of you, to jump in. How will the change in administration affect DEI, that is diversity, equity, and inclusion measures in the federal government? I guess this could mean DEI policies, like the ones we're seeing in our Brigida case, where hiring is affected by racial goals or racial quotas, or it could mean, I suppose, training within the federal workforce. Do either of you have a take on what the change in administration will mean for DEI broadly?
To Trent's whole of government approach, he was talking about the whole of government approach earlier on the sort of climate change issue. That also, I think the DEI and race and equality or equity really has been a major whole of government focus, to the extent that I know Mountain States was litigating against some of those issues as it related to farmer rancher relief. It's come up in that EPA regulation on air conditioners, and refrigerants, that opportunities should go to disadvantaged business entities, et cetera, new people entering the market. They should get priority. I do think that it will have an impact. I do think the new administration will not take that view. And I think that both in terms of training and what the government spends on DEI from an efficiency point of view, I think rolling back the quote unquote whole of government approach to infuse that into every single agency will have a difference. I think you even saw, some judges raising questions about it when it came to appointing, a monitor or that sort of thing. So I think that you will see it sort of across the board, whether it's again sort of soft action or more direct action. I think that you'll see a rollback of that.
Right.
Yep, I think that's right. I think this was one of the like high level topics that people who aren't lawyers and people who don't live in DC or anywhere near DC like understood. And I think Jeanette's right that like that's an issue that like that and immigration are like two of the top 3 or 4 issues that like the public understands, and they were, I think, kind of sent a pretty strong message. And so I suspect that under the new administration, a lot of the DEI, policies, procedures, regulations, like that's going to be a top priority to try to eliminate those. And as we've seen, like I guess it's kind of TBD, like how much influence he'll have in the end, like the Elon Musk, like efficiency, oversight, that sort of thing. Like a lot of that goes together. It's like, if the government's going to be spending all this money, and it will be spending a lot of money no matter what, and it's going to have a lot of employees no matter what, that we should be making decisions kind of based on like what's efficient and, who's the best person for the job and that sort of thing. And characteristics like race and sex really shouldn't come into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've mentioned Brigida, Jeanette alluded to our farmer rancher cases where we're suing USDA, the Department of Agriculture, over racial preferences, racial quotas in debt relief under COVID-19. We have an active matter on emergency relief being doled out based on race. I mean, all these things I would hope are reevaluated and go away in Trump administration. All right, next question. This relates to our conversation about slashing the federal government. It's from an anonymous user asking, what about public sector unions? Won't these unions make it impossible to reduce the number of employees who are working for the federal government, or impossible to cut away entire agencies? And I definitely have heard talk about Schedule F and the idea that the president can classify a good number of federal employees as fireable without normal protections. And then, of course, there are buyouts and there are ways of getting employees off the rolls. Do either of you have a take on some of the hurdles or obstacles that there might be, the system fighting back in order to protect itself from the swamp draining efforts?
I don't know that much about personnel, to be honest. I've thought about it a little bit in the context of the Department of Justice, because I've seen some reports that portions of DOJ are trying to unionize. And my kind of high level take is, there's Supreme Court case law saying that the president largely has authority over officers of the United States who are within the executive branch. And there are certainly federal employees who are not officers of any kind, but a lot of them are, especially if you're going into court and you're making arguments for the United States. You may not be a principal officer like an attorney general, but you could be an inferior officer. And generally, like I think the logical conclusion of the Supreme Court case law is that those sorts of individuals, officers of the United States who are in the executive branch, are ones that the president, if he wants, could fire at will. Now, like how that interacts with like Civil Service Reform Act is a harder question, but I think like attempts to kind of unionize are less likely to succeed in the face of the president trying to fire someone under Article 2 power to control the executive branch. Now, like, who knows? That's just really high level. That's kind of my initial thinking on what would happen within DOJ. As for the other agencies, I haven't thought about it, to be honest.
Jeanette, any thoughts?
No, I mean, I don't know. My basic thought is I think they will also sort of be the wet blanket that you were talking about, another layer of wet blanket. And I think that you see that, with in some of the efforts at education reform and education freedom, you see resistance from the various unions associated with the education process. So I think that's to be expected. But how effective that will be, I don't know.
I've definitely seen hot takes saying, the value of appointing someone controversial as the secretary or the attorney general is that all the people at the bottom resign and don't want to work for that person, which is eight-dimensional chess for sure. The next question, and we do have time, I think, for one more after this one, is about national monument designations. So, Jeanette, this is probably going to be for you and me. So famously, President Obama embarked on expanding national monuments, naming new areas as monuments, famously Bears Ears in Utah. President Trump shrunk those monuments area. President Biden re-expanded them and embarked on new areas. What should President Trump do here is the question, and are there ways of strategically announcing new monuments, I suppose, is the question, in order to protect certain dams? The questioner asked about lower Snake River dams, though I'm not completely familiar with whether that interacts with a monument designation. But are there ways of strategically using some of the power that a president has in order to either shrink monuments or do something else with the monuments area? I'll let you go first, and then I'll answer.
Yeah, I think it's an open question still because obviously there had been a lawsuit brought when Trump rolled back the Bears Ears Escalante monuments in the first place, and there were people who disputed the power of the president to do that under the Antiquities Act because they have the power to make the reservation, but not necessarily to roll it back. And that litigation was caught up during the entire administration. And so there was no progress made. So I think that I think President Trump thinks that he can roll back the monuments because he has done it before. I think that he should be able to, but I just don't know if it's actually going to have an impact until the question gets resolved as a legal matter. As it relates to additional strategic, quote unquote, strategic designations, again, to be principled, I've taken the position essentially that a designation of a monument shouldn't go further than what the Antiquities Act originally anticipated. And in the sort of designation and reservation as a monument, the president shouldn't be directing certain land use decisions. All of those decisions need to go through the processes that were put in place in the 1970s regarding public land management. That's part of, I think, what has gone wrong with our designation of monuments in the last 15 years is the president going beyond making the designation and then leaving it to the agency to determine how best to protect that monument. So I wouldn't be opposed necessarily to additional designations. I wouldn't want the president to go beyond the designation to make land management decisions.
Yeah, I 100% agree. So we've taken the position in Mountain States that these are at least reviewable decisions. Some courts have said it is not reviewable. A president has complete immunity in naming monuments in terms of scope and size of those monuments, and that seems to me crazy that a president could start just naming any part of the country a monument in order to stop development, stop growth. So certainly I agree with your take. You always say let's be principled, and here I definitely agree with you that we should be principled on this issue because of the long-term precedential effects of letting presidents have complete authority on monument designations. Okay, last question, and then we'll close. Is there anything that the Biden-Harris administration is doing that's sneaky on their way out the door that people ought to be paying attention to? And the example, I think, is the sage grouse. Just in the last few days, there have been some announcements about the habitat of the sage grouse and some resource management plans. Try anything on your radar, and then Jeanette, anything on your radar that you think might come out in the next few weeks?
I have nothing specific, but I can say that I'm sure they will be trying to do things like that. They're going to try to issue any final rules that have been outstanding. They're going to try to settle cases. They might try to enter into like consent decrees, which are especially difficult to undo. I don't know, like I don't have specific cases in mind, to be honest, but there's a lot of cases out there. And a lot of them are brought by people who are hostile to the administration, but not all of them. And the ones that are not, like, I suspect that they're discussing right now, like, how can we try to wrap this up on our way out the door? Like, what regs can we get out on the way out the door? What, appeals can we file? What briefs can we file? And sure, the incoming administration can undo some of that, but not all. But that always comes at a cost. If a case is fully briefed at the Supreme Court and the new administration comes in and says, actually, we're changing positions, the court will accept that in a few cases, but they don't want to suddenly have a third of their docket start flip-flopping all over the place. And so every administration, at least recently, views like the last 2 months as a critical time to try to lock in what you want and make the next team kind of feel as much pain as possible to try to undo it.
Donna, any thoughts?
Yeah, one of my concerns, I'm with Trent, I don't have necessarily anything specific, but I'm concerned about appropriations in particular. If you look at the EPA, FCC, State Department, there's a lot of appropriations that are made for grants to be issued. And once those funds are committed through a grant, it's difficult to get them back. So I think to the extent that there are grants out there that can be made and funds that can be committed in a way that the Trump administration won't be able to bring back, I've heard rumors about that with regard to more money to Ukraine, et cetera, whatever it might be. So I'm worried about sort of the Biden administration was really, really good at giving money away. That was sort of the main focus. If you got announcements from the United States Department of Agriculture, on their press release, every other press release was about how many hundreds of millions of dollars they were giving away. I think they'll try and give away every dollar they can before they're out the door.
Yeah. Cautionary tale, for sure. And in fact, I'll just add one example, which is I was on the Department of Education's website last week for something else, and I went to their policy guidance portal. And yes, they have issued guidance since the election, new guidance for all K-12 and university schools. They decided, I guess, to pick up the pen once they saw the election results. So definitely an active 2 months that we will need to be paying close attention to. With that, let me thank once again our incredible panelists, Trent McCotter and Jeanette Brown. What a fantastic discussion. Thank you to all of our guests here today. Stay tuned for our December So a Neighbor Asked webinar. And thank you for everyone who submitted a question and who is a part of Mountain States. You can learn more about Mountain States at mslegal.org. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Will.